Hello, everybody, and welcome to Economics with the Honorable David M. Walker. I'm Nick Pellavita. I'll be your moderator for today's show. In today's show, we're going to highlight a very famous case that came from the United States Supreme Court recently that affects the economy like none other. It's called Biden versus Nebraska, which is basically a Supreme Court case that struck down the Biden administration's attempt to eliminate $430 billion in student loans. Now, with that, joining us on the panel will be Lee Newton Rhodes, who's also a CPA, and you've seen him on our other shows. He'll be joining us with the Honorable David M. Walker, who's here just for a little while to discuss the very famous case now, Biden versus Nebraska. Now, in the Biden case, David, this was an attempt to alleviate $430 billion of student loans being wiped off the balance sheets of basically the people that took out student loans and transfer them to the American taxpayer with interest, as we well know. What are your thoughts about this case, Biden versus Nebraska?
Well, Nick, thanks. I've said from the very beginning when the president proposed this, that it had three problems. Number one, it was fiscally irresponsible. Number two, it was inequitable. And number three, as the Supreme Court affirmed, it was unconstitutional. The largest asset on the balance sheet of the United States government, believe it or not, is student loans, about $1.7 trillion. So they're a liability for the individual, but they're an asset for the federal government and for the taxpayers. The president tried to use the so-called HEROES Act of 2003 as a basis to forgive these loans. Now, first, there's two messages here. You can't necessarily go by what the title of the bill is to get an understanding as to what the contents of the bill is. But the second thing is, do you think there are tens of millions of people who went to college and got student loans that are heroes? Cut me a break, okay? That act was intended to provide temporary relief, underline the word temporary, because forgiveness is not temporary. Temporary relief primarily to military individuals and their families in the aftermath of 9/11. There were certain others that could be eligible for it. For example, if they were affected by the effects of 9/11, but never was that intended to cover as broad a swath as the president tried to cover. In addition to that, no president has the authority to unilaterally give away hundreds of billions of dollars of federal assets. It, in effect, is backdoor spending. And under the Constitution of the United States, only the Congress has the authority to spend money. And that's all this is. Now, the president now is talking about trying to use the Higher Education Act from the 1960s to try to do the same thing, and it will be struck down as well. And, all we have here is blatant political pandering for votes. And what's really frustrating is we had three significant Supreme Court cases this last week, which after we talk about student loans, maybe we can talk a little about the others. And Americans are not very knowledgeable about the Constitution. Americans are not very knowledgeable about the role of the Supreme Court. Supreme Court does not get involved in policy. That's the job of the Congress and the president. The Supreme Court is supposed to focus on the law and the Constitution and to decide whether or not something is legal and constitutional. And in this particular case, they didn't opine on the merits of what the president was proposing to do. They just said the president didn't have the ability to do it under the Constitution because Congress needs to expressly approve any potential forgiveness of student debt, especially given the amounts involved. So that's where we are. Happy to hear what you or Lee have to say. And if we want to talk briefly about the other cases, we can do that too.
Okay. I just have a quick question. You mentioned the heroes. They're not all heroes. What does this forgiveness have to do with being a hero? Can you explain that to the public?
Well, the act that the president tried to use to say that gave him the authority to be able to forgive these loans was the HEROES Act of 2003. And that was a piece of legislation that was enacted back then that gave the Secretary of Education the authority to provide temporary relief from student loans, not forgiveness, but temporary relief from student loans, like suspend payments, maybe adjust the interest terms or whatever, primarily for people who were in the military, and selected others. But it had nothing to do with what the president was proposing to do. It was a temporary thing. It was limited, and they called it HEROES because the people who were primarily involved were the people who were protecting the interests of the United States in the Middle East and the aftermath of 9/11.
Well,
Nick, you
the
mentioned
argument,
the doctor who got his loans forgiven, hundreds of thousands. How did that qualify as a hero? And now, why was it forgiven?
It didn't. Okay, I mean, it strained credibility. All right, to even call that. And quite frankly, we use the word hero too freely today. I mean, you hear it about every day for all kinds of things. I mean, it's gotten so misused that it's almost diluted the meaning of it.
apparently, though, when I was reading through the case that was brought before the Supreme Court, David, the Congress gave the secretary the ability to waive and modify the student loans. And under the waive and modify rule, that's where Biden got off on, well, we'll just waive 430 billion. Okay. When Congress delegated that much authority to the Secretary of Education to waive and modify that amount of student loans, was that partially the fault of Congress not to put stipulations on waive and modify?
Yes, but it's also not clear what waive means. Waive could mean delay payments, right?
Okay.
And in fact, that's what the president has done. The president suspended not only payments, but suspended the accrual of interest during the period of time of the pandemic, right? You know how much money that's costing us?
Billions.
Billion a year.
Right.
So he's already used the pandemic to be able to cost taxpayers 70 billion a year during that period of time. But there's a difference between waiving payments, meaning delaying payments. Okay, doesn't necessarily mean forgive payments.
Right.
All right, and modifying the terms, including the interest. I don't see any language in the HEROES Act or any other act, including the Higher Education Act, that talks about forgiving.
Yeah, that's
Are
true.
they not forgiving the interest that it's accruing?
Stay tuned.
Yeah, we're not sure about that. But the other thing, then, Justice Kagan, who wrote the dissent in the case, said there was an issue on standing. Now, this is where I think that she might be technically correct, but lose the case anyway. Because when I work with clients about legal matters, and one of them the other day had possibly a technically correct argument, but you can still lose. And that's where people just don't understand courts. Her technically correct argument was the states that brought the suit don't have standing. And what happened is Justice Roberts reached over to a subsidiary of a Missouri corporation that was created by the state that serviced the loan, and then said, well, Missouri has standing because they created a corporation that services loans, hence they have standing. But Kagan goes, you're reaching over to grab standing, and this case should be dismissed because of lack of standing. So it's quite possible that if you looked at the case technically, that Kagan was correct, that this case should have been brought by another party, which would be the servicing representative for Missouri.
Well,
what
first,
are your thoughts on that?
First, there were two cases, and one was dismissed due to standing. Okay, they were individuals who were not going to benefit from the program, and that case was dismissed due to standing. I think reasonable people can and will differ on the standing issue. Arguably, the persons that were most aggrieved, that clearly had standing, was the Congress of the United States. Now, when this
Right.
case was originally brought, the Democrats controlled both the House and the Senate. What should have happened is that when the Republicans took control in January, they should have joined the case,
Right.
because there's absolutely no question that the House had standing, because basically, people argue that the Supreme Court was trying to supplant itself for the Congress. That's exactly wrong. What was happening here was the president was trying to supplant himself for the Congress. He was trying to do things that only the Congress has the authority to do. And I think whatever he proposes to do under the Higher Education Act is likely to get struck down as well, although the Congress ought to be bringing the case.
Right. I agree. I agree.
And they represent the taxpayers, because ultimately bad news flows downhill, and you know who gets the bill.
Yeah, we're the ones paying for the loan. Now, on the other hand, there was a commentator on television who had actually taken out $50,000 in student loans. And he said, I'm married now, I have kids, I have a mortgage. It would be nice to have the $50,000 forgiven. Isn't it quite possible that Biden is just pandering to a group of young people that, remember, there's a lot of them out there, 1.7 trillion, 1.6 trillion of student loans, pandering to a group of people to vote for me because I'll get rid of your student loans? Is that quite possible that this is all
eliminate the word possible? That's exactly what's going on. It's political pandering. Okay. Nancy Pelosi made it very clear. And in fact, it was included in the argument.
It was included in the Supreme Court decision. That's true.
That the president doesn't have the authority to do that. Even Joe Biden said, well, I'm not sure that I have the authority to do this, but I'm going to give it a shot. Right. And when did they file? They filed before the midterms. This is nothing more than political pandering. Now, we're also not treating the disease here. College, costs are out of control. And in addition, you have too many people being able to get these loans that are going to questionable universities for degrees that they'll probably never get a return on the investment. All right. So the entire student loans, program needs to be reviewed and re-engineered. And we also need to think about alternatives to college, like trade schools and other things, where, quite frankly, we have needs. You can earn a good living, support a family, but it's not the traditional college route. And so I think this whole area needs to be looked at. And by the way, there were two other decisions, one of which also dealt with colleges. It had to do with, the affirmative action case as to whether or not you could use race as a basis for admission. And that case is also misunderstood, because basically what the court said is you can't use race as the primary basis to make decisions. In other words, you can't use race as a de facto quota system. But they didn't say that you couldn't consider that. What they said was that you need to do it when you're evaluating the merits of the individual as an individual. And therefore, the best way to do that is, to the extent that people want to make an argument in that regard, then they should do it through their essay. And so basically what they're saying is that you can take affirmative actions, but those actions have to be based on the merits of the individual. You can't just automatically be able to say that we're going to get a certain percentage of African Americans, of Hispanics, or whatever, that you can consider what their life experiences may have been and the disadvantages they may have been, which, by the way, doesn't just deal with those races. But you can't have a de facto quota system.
Dave, one question about the student loans. Why is the government in the business? If you want any other type of loan, you either go to a bank or you go to the institution that's selling you the product, such as the car manufacturer or a Citibank. Why is the government in the student loan business? Go to the college or go to a private bank.
Well,
am I wrong?
Well, there used to be private, private loans. Okay. and then the government decided years ago, I think about 20 years ago, that it was more cost effective for the government to do this directly rather than to have the private sector do it and then potentially the government guaranteeing them. All right.
Why should the government guarantee them at all?
Well, okay.
They don't guarantee my car loan.
Yeah, I understand that. And the argument is theoretically that it's in our broader economic interest to have a well-educated and productive population. But again, it's also based on the flawed theory that everybody needs to go to college, that all colleges are equal and all degrees are equal. That's fundamentally flawed. And that's why I say the whole thing needs to be re-looked at, re-engineered. The other thing is that when you get the government involved, that means politics gets involved. All right. I mean, the private sector is not going to be forgiving loans like this. I can assure you. Okay. So, that's the danger of big government, that they don't do it as economically and efficiently and effectively. But secondly, then you get politics in there and people are starting to make decisions based upon what's in their short-term political interest, but not in the long-term interest of the nation and the citizens of the nation.
Hey, David, quick question for you. A couple of quick questions. One is one's a statement, but I actually had a Pell Grant, had a couple of other grants as well when I went to Marquette University and everything. And the Pell Grant was actually founded to Lee's point way back in 1965. So I'm thinking it was probably under Kennedy and some of the others that were doing some stuff around equality and equity and all in that space. So it is getting ready to celebrate its 65 to 2025 would be getting ready to come up on its 60th anniversary. So the Pell Grant has been out there for a number of years. But one of the things that I was seeing, and I think you might have alluded to it, but even though that was struck down, apparently there is a new program that is out there and they're asking people to go and file for that because apparently it was a backup plan. Because, you can't be a politician and not have a backup plan. So there was something called SAVE, which was going to be out there as well as Repay. And it was going to be dealing with income inequality. So apparently there was going to be a pause on payments for people who made less than 225% of the federal poverty level and some other things. And they were saying that they were asking folks to enroll fairly soon and all in that space. So will that get struck down as well? And will they be getting some scrutiny in that, or will the backup plan that is actually going to work and all in that space? Because apparently he has something in plan.
Well, first, if they thought this plan was a good plan, why didn't they go with it to begin with? Right. The second thing is that in my opinion, with the amounts involved, unless the statute that they're relying on provides express language that the executive branch has the authority to forgive all or part of the loans, it will be struck down. Yeah. Because this is the largest asset on the balance sheet of the U.S. government. Only Congress can decide only Congress has the authority to deal with spending. Giving away a federal asset is de facto spending. Okay. And so I think that, they're going to try to go with plan B, but why they're trying to go with plan B? There's another election coming up.
Yep, exactly.
Let's call it what it is. This is trying to buy votes. That's what this is, plain and simple.
Biden knew when they started this mess that this effort would get struck down by the Supreme Court because he knew he didn't have authority to do it. It was a false promise. It was done strictly for political purposes, and it was a joke to begin with. And the Democrats, to say anything else, are being very disingenuous, and it's just more rhetoric on the part of the left.
Well, look, I think, as Nick said, reasonable people can and will differ on the standing argument. Okay. On the merits, I think the Supreme Court was exactly right. Okay. Reasonable people can and will differ about whether or not there ought to be some relief under certain circumstances. And that's understandable as well. But that's not the job of the Supreme Court. That's the job of the Congress of the United States. All right.
But Dan, hold on a second, because I wanted to double check before I made this statement, because I didn't want to say it and then be wrong. But you said that it was political grandstanding on the part of the Democrats. But as I recall, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, there was actually student loan debt forgiveness that was part of the stimulus plan of President Trump back in 2020 and all in that space. So it's not something that is just a Democratic issue. I would say that both parties have been.
Well, Mark, you're confusing the matter. Like you said, it was part of the legislative package. Congress does have the authority to do that. The president doesn't, and the Supreme Court ruled that way. So the Supreme Court, Justice Roberts said, we're not against debt relief, some debt relief that's reasonable, but it's up to Congress to do it, not the president, not the executive. That was the point. And Trump was absolutely right to try to push it through Congress rather than try to make it, an imperial decision. Biden seems to think that being president means he can be a dictator. He can do anything he wants. He has everything. Most of what he's done by his executive orders has been in the face of constitutional mandates against it. He's been, they claim Trump was a dictator. Biden's far worse and taking us in a far more dangerous direction as a country.
One of the things that people are claiming right now, Mark, where they're comparing apples and oranges, is they're saying, well, gee, we gave away hundreds of billions of dollars. Well, we forgave hundreds of $billions in PPP loans. All right. And that's true. And believe me, there was a lot of abuse of that program.
Oh, yeah.
Billions of abuse in that program, hundreds of billions. Okay. But there's the big fundamental difference. The difference is that was authorized by Congress and signed by the president. In this particular case, with regard to the decision by the Supreme Court last week, the president was trying to exercise executive authority where the Congress did not provide express authorization for this. And I think that's what he's trying to do again.
Yeah.
He's going to get struck down again.
Yeah.
But what is this forgiveness of PPP loans, David? Where is it that the U.S. government has the money? Because the last time I looked at our balance sheet, we're 31 billion in debt.
They don't.
Where do they get off?
They don't. But here's another fundamental difference. Okay.
Yeah.
And again, there was massive abuse in that program. The government just did a terrible job of running that program. The government shut down large parts of the economy.
Right.
All right. That was involuntary. There were businesses that were adversely affected because of the government's actions. All right. Similar things happened in the aftermath of 9/11 when the government shut down the airspace for a period of time. All right.
No TV.
On student loans is the government doesn't force anybody to go to college. People decided they wanted to go. People decided they wanted to take the loan. All right. And so it's a total apples and oranges situation. But the biggest difference from a legal standpoint is Congress expressly authorized it and the president signed it. It was a piece of legislation, even though it was a flawed piece of legislation.
Right. Yeah. Well, the thing is, I just think that it was a pandering for votes. This whole, hey, we're just going to forgive your student loans. And now he's also putting out, well, we'll just go find a different way to forgive student loans. Now, if he does that, we have $31
billion in deficits every year. Okay. I mean, so this is like on top of that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, things are out of control. But my point is, if the president has the authority, and I'm talking about any president, not just this president, okay? If the president has the authority to give away federal assets, what's next?
David, along those same lines, though, I read an interesting article, and some folks may say it's not totally tied, but I think that it has some ties, because you're talking about how a lot of the college education is becoming, I won't say obsolete, but in some ways not as needed as maybe people think it is needed, and all in that space. And I read an article, I think it was yesterday, maybe it was a couple of days ago, that was talking about the ladies of our life, whether that is our mothers or our significant others or whatever, but it literally said that about 80% of the jobs that women hold are about to be eliminated, which is more than those that will be eliminated for the fellow man, the five of us that are men here. I think Kim was here at one point, and all in that space, but also those others that are of the male species because of AI, because they said that 80% of the women's jobs, because they are of a certain type of jobs, are about to be eliminated by AI, and all in that space. So we might need to be worrying about that as well. What are your thoughts, David?
Well, I'd have to see that because I got a hard time believing that. I mean, the fact is, if you look at who generally does the best academically in college, it's women, not men. Okay, so I don't know. I'd have to read that, but on its face, I would say that's a bunch.
I will send it to you, but the article is basically that a lot of the jobs that women get, unfortunately, are still in the service-based industry, an industry that is more susceptible to being hit by AI, whether that is secretarial work, whether that is teaching work, whether that is a number of other kind of jobs like that. But that was the gist of what the nature of the jobs that.
Well, Mark, I think the bottom line is the right way to do the analysis is what's the nature of the job. Okay, so it could be that women, tend to be in more jobs that are more likely to be displaced.
Right, and that's what
okay, but women that are in jobs that are less likely to get displaced by AI, I think, are less likely to get displaced. Okay, for lots of reasons, not only because of performance, but because of efforts to try to achieve a more pluralistic workforce, and I which I think is a good thing. I just don't think you want quotas.
Right, David. Do you also think when the government got involved in this whole student loan fiasco, which they've been involved for a long time, that it artificially pushed up the cost of going to college?
Absolutely,
especially in private schools. Some of the schools I went to, some of the schools that I taught at. The tuition, was maybe 1/10 of what it is today. In other words, I think at University of Miami, where I went to law school, right now the tuition just alone, forget room and board, it's like $56,000 a year. So if you go for 3 years to get a law degree, you've got over $150,000, $160,000 in tuition, plus you have room and board. You're spending $200,000 to get a law degree. I mean, have we seen the student loans factor into an artificial inflation in the education area?
The answer is absolutely yes. And the second thing is, while this may be a controversial statement, we already have too many lawyers. My undergraduate school.
He's talking about Dan up there.
No.
I'm retired, so
this is not my undergraduate school, which I won't mention. Okay, just started a law school, and they hit me up. They wanted me to try to give them some money for the law school, and my comeback was, the country already has too many lawyers.
Yeah, actually, a lot of the law schools have actually failed recently. Like Valparaiso no longer has a law school anymore. There's quite a few law schools that have gone under because they've graduated too many attorneys, and a lot of people aren't going into the legal profession because you're upside down financially if you go into the legal profession today. But
and a lot of people get law degrees but don't practice law. My youngest brother has a law degree, graduated from Florida State. He practiced a little while, but he basically uses law degree as a tool to do other things.
Right.
That's because he went to Florida State.
More people are doing that.
That's because he went to Florida State, Dave.
To Florida State.
If he would have gone to Florida, it would.
They used to have a decent football team, although they
did at one point.
Yeah, well, I just think you see an artificial inflation in the education area. The other thing which you described was the degrees that have value. Now, I made a mistake years ago because I listened to my attorney friend who says you got to get your degree in political science to go to law school, which, by the way, is not true. The best degree is actually in the hard sciences, not political science. But let's imagine if your terminal degree was political science and you went to a major university and you spent literally you could spend $200,000 today to get a bachelor's degree in political science. Isn't that a waste of financial resources?
But Nick, I'm going to give a counter argument to what you're saying and everything, because one of the things that they say is a wasteful degree and all in that space is, and I've got friends in this space, but are degrees in the arts and all along those lines. But there have been several studies, including some of a number of prominent folks that have said that if you want to have a better understanding of being able to do critical thinking and be able to analyze things in a very good nature of all of that space, it is good to actually have a art background and a philosophy background and all in that space. So I imagine that some of your lawyer friends actually probably had a undergraduate degree in something that was arts related because they got that feeling. I mean, I went to a Jesuit university, Marquette, and that is one of the things that they pride themselves on is the fact that they give you a well-grounded and well-balanced education. One of the things that may surprise Dan and everything is that at that Jesuit university, I practically had a religious minor because they required you to have 12 hours of, I always get them confused, but I think it was 12 hours of 4 courses of theology and 9 hours of philosophy. And that is something that was required of everybody that majored in the 80s at that time. And I think it's still a requirement at that prestigious university.
Same as BYU.
Yeah, but see, I think it's a waste. I mean, I think what that whole theory of this, what they call it, liberal arts education, is a complete waste of time and money. It's only promulgated by the people that are professors at those schools that teach those subjects to maintain their jobs. It is not valuable at all. No,
Mark, to your point, though, Mark, those are electives. And one can argue those are important electives, but as a major, that's something different.
No. Yeah. I mean, the thing is, and I think what happens is that the students are not counseled into the realities of this environment today. Now, if you go back to the turn of the century and you're a son and daughter of a king and a queen, go get your liberal arts degree. But if you're talking about this economy and this today, you need to be in a STEM related area, or don't go to college.
But to your point, there was a very popular book that was out there in the 80s, and I don't think my nephews have this book, but I won't say the name of the book and all in that space. But I do think that it was a very popular book, and it actually helped guide some people's decisions on their careers and why they decided to go into the careers that they went into. But I'm sure everybody here remembers a book that was called "What Color Is Your Parachute?" and all along those lines. That I don't know that our kids are necessarily knowing that book or even reading that book and all in that space. But what are your thoughts, David? Do you remember What Color Is Your Parachute?
Yeah, I don't know. I know what my Myers-Briggs is. Okay, I don't remember what color my parachute is. Blue's my favorite color, but I like red, white, and blue. But anyway, so look, I think you got to let the data look at the data. Okay, people that end up getting degrees from certain universities or certain types of degrees follow the data. What type of return on investment do they get? All right,
that's right.
And my personal view is I think it is good to have certain liberal arts courses. I generally agree with Nick that if you have a liberal arts degree at the baccalaureate level and that's all you have, I don't have the data, but my gut feeling is the data is going to show is you don't have as much opportunity or as much return on investment. Now, on the other hand, if you're going to get a liberal arts degree and then you're going to get a master's degree in something else, all right, then that could change things. Or as Nick said, if you're not going to get a degree that's marketable, then you need to think about other alternatives, whether it's a trade school or something else, if you will. And I don't think we do a very good job. I know we don't do a very good job in K through 12 education in providing people enough information to be able to make informed decisions. Maybe what color is your parachute? That type of concept is something that we ought to be talking to students about before they're making a decision where they are going and what they're going to.
And that's basically what Color Your Parachute is. It's a self-help book that was written by Richard Nelson Bowles, and it was intended for job seekers, for them to get an idea of what what kind of jobs they wanted to go into, what the jobs existed, and
You're going to do better on things that you like. Okay,
Right.
there's no question about that. Whatever that might be, but again, I come back to something we've talked about before on this program. In my opinion, nobody should graduate from high school without having a financial literacy course
Right.
and a civic responsibility course. Those are the two big holes we have, and I think it's one of the reasons why we have so much dysfunction. All right, not only societally but also in government, and while people don't understand, things like the role of the Supreme Court, and while they're somewhat insensitive to the fact that we've got $32 trillion in debt and growing rapidly, and what the implications of that are for our country and for them over time if we don't change course.
I hear what you're
And
saying.
the other thing is not only is it important to have that financial literacy course in high school, David, I believe it's even more important because the second biggest financial decision you're going to make in your life is going to be at the age 18,
Right.
generally, when you determine what school you go to and how much you're going to pay for it.
Right.
And you've been given no financial course on doing this at all. Instead, I mean, this is what I understand today. They hand you a piece of paper, sign this piece of paper, and money will flow into your bank account to take care of your education and other needs. But it's a loan. It's not a grant.
And
Okay,
then
and
here's
there's a
what
big
happens, Nick.
Difference.
And here's what happens, because I did it when my son went to Villanova. Okay.
Mhm.
You go to when they're first starting college, and you got a bunch of credit card companies
Right.
now, all right, trying to get you to sign up for a credit card. So it's not just the student loans, it's the credit card companies, and the interest rates that they charge are multiple times what you pay on student loans.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And if you,
Yeah.
I
And
hate
then,
I'm going to need to get going, but why don't you
Okay.
finish your thought, Nick, and you guys can.
I just want to make a plug to the University of Georgia educational system for people that don't know. If you graduate from a school in Georgia, you with a 3.0 or better, you get to go to any Georgia school free tuition, and that includes University of Georgia, Georgia Tech, Georgia Southern, and Georgia State. Now you can imagine that you get to go to college free for 4 years at Georgia Tech or University of Georgia. And how they did it, here's the magic how the University of Georgia did, how they were able to do it. They actually took their lottery money and they used it to fund education, as opposed to the state of Florida, who said we're going to do it. Then they diverted the
And
funds
they didn't.
to their general account.
It's
So
a
there
Hope
are
Scholarship.
bargains
Still
out
got to
there.
qualify to get in.
Pardon?
It's the Hope Scholarship.
It's the Hope Scholarship,
It's
right?
a great program. I lived
Right.
in Georgia twice, but
Yeah.
you still have to meet the admission standards to get in.
That's correct. You have to meet the admission standards, but it's a great program.
It is
But out
a-
there, if you go through the whole country, there are these little places you can go to keep your tuition down and go to some very great schools. At very
But Nick,
uh,
some of
cost.
those programs, and I know David said he's got to bounce off, but some of those programs could be threatened by the other ruling that we talked about, which is the affirmative action program and the affirmative action ruling. Because one of the programs, reason I got to go to Marquette was because of a family connection and a family tie from the civil rights, but also because the gentleman that was running that program was running something called EOP, that if you were from a certain economic standpoint or if your grades were not all that great, you were able to get into that elite university. And I don't know that that program would exist in the current inclination of what was going on. So I might not get that Marquette degree that I am very proud to have, and all in that space, because like I said, I was in a rural part of North Carolina. The grades were so they weren't that great, and definitely the economics were not going to allow me to go to that school in Milwaukee that is not a cheap school to go to, and all in that space. But it was a program that you had to apply for. You had to have the qualifications that they required and all of that, and that is how I was able to obtain that degree.
I've got to leave, but let me just say, Mark, you're making a good point, and we'll have to see what the ramifications are of this decision. Okay.
Mhm.
Because basically what we're saying is you cannot discriminate because of gender, race, religion, fill it all out. Okay. You cannot discriminate. All right. What the case says is in effect, though, you can't discriminate the other way either. All right, to say that just because you are X or Y or Z, that you get a preference, right? But they didn't say you couldn't consider certain factors such as economic disadvantage and such as past transgressions or whatever. They said you can consider that. And I think only God knows how this thing is going to shake out. And it's going to take some time to see. But we should have zero tolerance for discrimination. We should take affirmative actions, in my view. All right. But we shouldn't have quotas.
Right.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.
All right. Thanks, David.
David, have a good day.
Bye-bye.
I don't think it's going to affect things that much, Mark.
The more things change, the more things remain.
Well,
the
there's
same.
Mark, the case that you made about yourself is social economic. That's nothing to do with race. Am I wrong?
Like I said, it was part of the program was around race and socioeconomic.
But you know, the thing is that's one way to allow diversity and inclusion is to don't take into effect race, but take into effect social economic, because that's where you see the largest amount of discrimination, because the people that don't have a lot of money, but they may have a lot of ability, aren't included.
I mean, one of the
in
arguments that
these
folks have
places.
made even in the civil rights era is that the two are not mutually exclusive and everything, meaning that there are ties that have to do with socioeconomic issues that also are played into the racial issues as well. So as long as we understand that and address that, then I can see where you're coming, Lee. But there are things that are connected together, and that is across the board. I've heard Republicans.
Well, they're going to have to modify some things.
Left-wing people say that. I've heard a number of people talk about the interconnection.
No, I get that, Mark. But like with quotas based on race, who does it help? The minorities? That the more well-to-do minorities are the ones being accepted in these institutions.
Well, like I said,
They didn't get there anyways.
No, I was on a show yesterday that was separate from our network, if I remember correctly, and everything. But it was talking about that to a degree, because it was actually talking about the Asian population and how some of the elitist Asians are the ones that get the better benefits in that space and everything, and that there are some Asians that are not part of the elite group.
Do you have something against Asians, Mark?
I don't have nothing against Asians. I have some very dear friends in that
You're
space.
racist if you do.
No, that would be very much the case.
So if Asians perform better on the test and will perform better in the colleges, don't you think they deserve the slots?
No, the question, Dan, is: are there some?
I mean, us whites
Asian
will
groups?
suffer,
Are there
right?
some Asian groups that
Well,
get
they're Indians, or whatever
benefits
you wanna
because
call
of
them.
the elitist nature of their parts of society? We're talking about like the very almost like the rich kind of Asians that can afford to come here, that maybe are from parts of.
Well, don't you have rich blacks? They have the same kind of attitudes.
Oh, I've said that
Oh,
before.
yeah,
There are African Americans that have that do not do enough to give back to their own community, and I just alluded to one of those on one of our
Why should
other
they?
shows
Well, I
and
mean,
everything.
are they obligated to give back to your community?
No, you're not obligated to do anything, but I mean, if you come from a certain community, should you have a I won't say requirement, but should you have like almost a moral duty to give back to where you came from? If those,
I don't know. That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I don't know either.
But
But
I don't think there's a moral imperative to do that. No, I mean you may
Again, not from a government standpoint, but from a religious standpoint, yes. But that
religious
we're not talking.
Sure, yeah. I mean, from a Christian standpoint, or
Right.
or
yeah, that's where I was
other
going, and that's
religious
where a lot of the
standpoint.
church leaders go as
but-
well. Is that if you
Sure, but see that's because you guys see things race in a bifurcated way. I mean, if people aren't acting black, then you call them Oreos, right?
no, not necessarily.
You've heard the term, Mark.
that phrase used before.
Oh yeah, no, you do.
I've never used the
So
phrase before.
if you get blacks who don't agree with the mainstream viewpoint, then you're in the black community. Then you guys are racist against them.
No, I think there are a number of folks that have disagreed.
Well, Tim Scott's an example of that. You know, I mean, it's funny because
What about Tim Scott?
I'm
Like I
talking
said-
about the Democrats and the liberal side of the party that have been enslaving blacks for years now, right? that have been suppressing blacks really because of the politics of it. And that is the politics of the left. They suppress the blacks. They do. They say, well, let's give them more right to vote. Then they keep them down with social programs. And I mean, affirmative action really has hurt the blacks more than it's helped them. I've read a number of articles about that have been written by people who are black.
Yeah, there are some aspects of that, but there are affirmative action programs that have definitely leveled the playing field, even in the newsrooms and everything.
It certainly didn't hurt Clarence Thomas.
It was definitely not hurt Clarence.
No, not Clarence Thomas. No.
According to the report
Tim
that I
Scott.
read, that Clarence Thomas,
Or Barack
Who became-
Obama.
yeah, he became a Supreme Court justice because of affirmative action, and then he voted against affirmative action.
Or Joe
So-
Biden, who's black.
You know. So,
Or the latest Supreme Court justice we have now, Ketanji.
yeah, well, to me, that was completely racial motivated.
Oh, it
That
was,
just-
'cause
that demonstrates
course.
that Joe Biden is a racist. There's just absolutely no
is.
question.
He's a racist.
You know, and because he never said, I'm going to look for the most qualified candidate. He said, I need a black woman. He's
Well, or
racist and
gay,
sexist.
or transsexual, or
Or
whatever.
whatever.
But I mean,
It has to be.
We like
hold on
the
a second.
secretary,
Hold on a
Dan.
second. We do that on politics all the time, and it's either
We
on
do
a
what,
number
Mark?
of things, whether it is
Do
race,
what?
whether pick a candidate that you think is going to address a constituency that you want and everything. So the both
Oh,
of
you
them
mean Kamala?
do that
Is
and
Kamala?
everything. So
That what you're talking about, Kamala?
Well,
I'm talking about a number of folks. We can look at some of the
designed- it's
policies of
designed
Richard
really
Nixon.
to-
You can look at some of the policies
to
of
get
Reagan.
voted.
You can look at a number of policies of a couple of folks that they have picked folks out because they feel that it will help their candidacy. I will not be
Yeah,
surprised.
it's just
if-
like,
I will not be surprised. Hey, hold on a second, Nick. I will not be surprised, and I don't know who it would be. Maybe DeSantis, because he has some
Mark?
Latin background. But I would not be surprised there is a growing Latin population if Trump is the presumptive nominee, if he does not pick somebody that is Latin American to be his vice president, because that is a constituency that he wants to address, or in Asia.
Yeah.
Mark, how would you feel if you found out that Nick and Kimberly got you to be the producer because of the color of your skin?
Like I said, I know my skill set, so I know that's why they got me to do it and all in that space.
No,
mean,
it was just because of the color of your skin. There.
Like I said, I know that isn't the case, but I know people that have gotten jobs in this space. We even have an entire program that we just ended this yesterday that deals with black business and black business community. And all
No,
of
and
that.
that's good. Al, that's good. Really, I'm just getting
Yeah.
teasing you.
yeah. Well, the thing
So
is,
is Lee. So is Lee.
the world is different out west
think.
where Dan lives. I can tell you that than it is in the deep south where we live. It's just a different environment.
It's
Yeah,
all
there
love
There
here.
are some people that would think that the
So-
Good Old Boy Network doesn't exist anymore.
Oh,
But I
it did
know for a
exist.
fact that the
That
Good Old Boy
Good
Network
Old Boy
is-
Network
is
exists
very real and
everywhere.
still definitely exists and everything. So
It's alive and well.
That
Here's the
gobble,
good old bro network.
that exists everywhere. So it's not it.
Yeah.
But the economics of this $400 billion giveaway is not good. But it's
speaking of the
something that
economics. Hey, Nick, speaking of the economics,
really
I
has
will
to address.
pivot the conversation. One of the things that I know that some of my friends get frustrated by, because you were talking and even Lee was talking about the amount of money that is costing to go to some of these universities, whether that's Ivy League or whether that's a number of other universities, even some of our community colleges. And I don't think that we need to sleep on our community colleges, because they oftentimes give a better education than our college systems do in certain fields and all in that space. But I know for a fact that a lot of times the professors are on almost like a year-to-year contract. They're oftentimes not making as much as even their fellow students think they are making, and a lot of them are barely surviving. I can't say what it's like there in Utah where Dan had been practicing, but I do know that as a professor, but I do know quite a few, including some right around the corner from me over here at Duke, that are struggling on those year-to-year contracts. And we won't even talk about the HBCUs and some of the women's college and some of the smaller universities and all in that space. So is that something that it needs to be considered as well, is making sure that our teachers are being equitably paid, including our college professors?
It depends what college you're in as to what the pay scales are. And it also depends on what position you get in the college. Now, Dan might be able to address that better than me. I've only taught for 3 universities, and they all were different as the pay
Well,
scales.
Dan, aren't you an adjunct professor? And some of my friends are adjunct professors, and they told me that it is not a
I
pretty
thought, Dan, you
picture.
were
It is
an
not a
associate
pretty
dean.
picture for the adjunct professor.
Oh, I'm retired. You got to remember that.
But
I
one time,
don't-
weren't you the associate dean at University?
Oh
of South?
yeah, and I taught
Yeah.
a number of places. I mean,
Yeah.
just like you, but
But what
it's
you're
very
saying-
different depending on where. I mean, you're right.
Was,
the
was the
contracts
pay,
aren't
pay
nearly as-
scale decent when you were at South Dakota Law School?
No,
Really?
No.
yeah, no, it sucked.
Really?
Yeah, and that's what I
Wow.
was thinking. It sucked at the universities like that. And can you address to our audience a little bit of the adjunct professor thing? Because, like I said, I have a dear friend that is actually working on a documentary, not about that, but about another topic to deal with music and entertainment. But he's been an adjunct
Yeah.
for decades, and is oftentimes telling me that it's not that easy to live off of.
No, you can't live off being. You got
can't live
to
off.
actually work for a living if you're.
No,
gonna-
no, it's an adjunct. You have to have another job besides.
Yeah, you got to have a primary
It's
job to
part-time.
be an adjunct.
Yeah.
Right.
It's really just considered part-time work.
It's not
Nick-
intended to be full time.
Nick, our educational system, K through 12, is paid by the taxpayer, primary through real estate taxes, what have you. Why is post K through 12 also funded, at least partly, by the government? Why is it not just by the person who's benefiting from whatever product they're buying?
I don't understand the
Lee,
question.
I mean, part
Yeah.
of what you're
I
part of
So
what you're-
understand what you said.
Let them be the customer and pay for the product.
but
Why
Lee,
is the
part of what
government
you're
involved?
asking? Part of what
Oh,
you're asking
okay,
is
I understand.
like to just take the research Anchor Park where me and Nick are and everything.
Similar to
If I'm
technical
hearing you-
colleges,
if I'm hearing
vocational
you
college.
correctly- Hold a second, Lee. If I'm hearing you correctly, what you would like to have happen is if, say, the pharmaceutical companies are making lots of money and they are training biotechs and a number of other fields, people in that field, that if I'm hearing you correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, that instead of the taxpayers making that money, maybe somebody like a GlaxoSmithKline or Bristol Myers or whatever should be putting more money into the system since they are getting the reward from said training. Am I hearing you correctly in that idea?
I'm sorry, I understand your question. Who's doing the research? If the big pharma is doing the research and they're the ones who are footing it, then they should get the profits. If it's the universities that are doing the research, they should get the profits. Am I wrong?
No, what I'm saying is that if Big Pharma is needing the people from Big Pharma to come to work for them, should the Big Pharma be paying for the people to get that education?
No, just like the big law firms don't pay for the lawyers to get the education. They do it on their own dime.
They do it when they're done. But Lee, you always have the option if you don't like the product out there, which is your public school, you have the option to pay for private schools. So the first.
No, I got that. You could do the same thing with private college.
I went to
But
private
why do we have public colleges to begin with? Why is it the government doing that?
Oh, why is the government doing colleges as opposed
Yes.
to that? Because they're again, it's accessibility. You know, the real reason they're the public schools around is so that people have access at a lower rate. I'll give you an example. Right where we live, there's University of North Carolina and Duke. Okay, if you go to UNC and you came from the state of North Carolina, the tuition is about $8,000 a year. It's next to dirt cheap nothing. It's a top 30 school in the country. You go to Duke, which is top 10. Okay, it's like $60,000 a year. All right, that's a big difference paying $8,000 a year tuition than $60,000. Now you as a consumer have the option to pay the $60,000 or the $8,000. Under today's environment where Uncle Joe's going to pick up the tab, I'll just go borrow the $60,000 and as a loan, and then go tell Uncle Joe to pay for it when I'm done.
But Nick, to
I know, but that lower tuition is really not the lower tuition because the taxpayers pay partial tuition for you.
No, but to Lee's point,
Yeah,
hold on a second.
it's supplemented by the
No,
state.
but to Lee's point, and I don't know the answer to this, UNC was created as a state school. It was created as a state school way back in, let's say, the 1800s. I don't remember the exact year and everything. So I guess the question that Lee is asking is, why was it created as a state school, and do we still need state schools? Because it was created, and there's several of them around here, UNC, North Carolina.
That's almost exactly my point, Mark.
So I got your point. So I'm trying to say, do we still
Thank
need
you.
state schools? Why were they created, and do we still need them? And all in that space, I think that's what Lee is asking. Because
Exactly.
all-
That's a taxpayer dime. Right.
It seems to be the answer is yes, we still do because there's such a demand. The biggest schools in the country are state schools. Let's go look at another thing.
No,
UNC,
why is it the biggest demand? Because there's less tuition, because they're not paying full tuition. I'm paying, if I go to state school, I went to Georgia State, okay?
they're
So I
basically-
paid I paid for my tuition, but
yeah,
somebody else, the taxpayer, also put
Right.
money into that institution.
yeah, you're getting subsidized if you go to a state school. State schools are.
Is that right to expect people who don't go to college to pay for the guy who does?
Who don't? Oh, you mean somebody who doesn't go to college paying taxes for,
To support the
people
state.
that do.
That's why state schools are so cheap, because the people who
Right.
don't go are paying also.
Yeah, yeah.
What
I mean,
other product do we have that? You want to underwrite my car, my restaurant bill, my house? Why do you have to underwrite my education?
You
If it's
know,
an electric car, we'll underwrite it.
That is true. Nick, to your point, when you asked David about
Yeah.
that, in terms of
I
why
mean-
tuitions went up when the government's subsidizing, they gave the $7,500 rebate for electric cars. What do electric car companies do? They just raise the price.
right, exactly right. Yeah, well, I mean, you're making a valid argument that state schools should be independent of the economy rather than sucking money out of the government, which is a
100%. That's yes.
which is a valid argument.
It gives
Because
them
the thing
more
is,
of an
right now,
incentive to raise
you're
prices.
having taxpayers that are actually subsidizing education, but it also looks. Let's say you're a consumer of education, and your choices go to Emory, since you're in Emory.
No, I lived around the corner from Emory. I know it very well.
All right, Emory, and you pay.
Steve went there.
Steve went there, right? You spend
Yeah.
50,000-60,000 a year, or you can go to Georgia State,
Which is what
a
I did.
Great university down in the middle
And I
of
paid
Atlanta.
nothing for
You
peanuts.
pay next to nothing. If you're
Right.
smart, you go to Georgia State. Forget Emory. Okay.
Yes.
You know,
That's
if
what I
you
did.
have
Because
money
there's not
to
that big of a
burn,
difference in
money to burn
education.
like Steve does, go to Emory. You know,
Well, I'm
you
sorry,
can't get
Dan?
into Georgia State, go to Emory.
There's not that
Okay.
big of a difference.
Oh, we
in
have to go.
education.
And in education, no. In tuition, yes.
Yeah,
Right.
that's right.
Yeah.
I know we got to bounce, but just really
We gotta
quickly,
bounce.
talk about this next week. But
We'll
I just
see
looked
it.
it up in scholarships.com, and they said that affordable tuition, dynamic atmosphere, on-campus employment opportunities, loyal student body, and flexibility, knowledgeable instructors, and challenging courses were the reason to go to a state school. And the cons
Right.
were finding out information and availability of classes and accessibility of professors, and students may get lost in the crowd.
They're bargains.